So hello everyone and welcome to another conversation of the second cycle of conversations on corporeal architecture. And today I am really honored to have as guest Sergei Gepshtein, PhD, is a scientist working in the areas of perceptual psychology, systems neuroscience, and computational neuroscience. He is a member of the Center for the Neurology of Vision at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies in La Jolla, California, where he studies perception and active behavior from the mechanistic point of view of neuroscience and from a point of view that respects visual experience as a research focus in its own right. He also directs the Center for Spatial Perception and Concrete Experience at the University of Southern California, Los Angeles. He is the inaugural recipient of the Harold Hay Research Award from ANFA in 2013. Sergei, very happy that you accepted this invitation.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm very glad to be here.
So you can start sharing your screen whenever you would like.
Yes, but before we start, let me ask about the format of our conversation. Shall we make it a really conversation, or rather I will talk a little bit about some of the themes we discussed, and then we'll launch the conversation.
I think it's good to have a little talk before to introduce to some of the topics, and then we can continue with the conversation.
Okay, let's do that. So I will launch my presentation. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, so I will make it so I can see my ground. Okay, here it is. So the larger theme we wanted to discuss today was defined as populism, which may sound a little negative, but overall spirit of what I'm going to talk about is very positive and optimistic. Before we talk about populism, I will introduce a number of ideas that I think are useful to define the parameters of what we are doing in this new arena between the whole array of scientific disciplines on the one hand, and the whole array of design disciplines on the other hand. I tend to introduce this idea using the concept of two cultures by C.P. Snow, which is a very well known idea, or at least it used to be very well known, as a way to conceive the incompatibility, the incommensurability of the way architects or artists or literary folk think about the world as opposed to the scientists. And here is a C.P. Snow shown sitting on the bridge, this proverbial bridge that we are talking about all the time, connecting the sciences on the one side, represented by the microscope, and connecting a Greek author on the other side. So this is the bridge we are talking about. And indeed, it is the case that quite often we assume that there are two cultures, and we talk about things differently on the two sides of the divide. Let me just go very briefly over the terms that we tend to use in these conversations. So the scientists often, not always, but most often talk about the physical world, which is discovered by the scientific method. They form the so-called scientific image of the world, discovered by these specialized methods. The knowledge and understanding procured by the sciences is objective. It is public in the sense that it's deposited in scientific journals, where methods are detailed and everybody in the world could replicate the results, supposedly. And this image, this world, are thought of as mind independent. This is how the reality is, independent of what we think about it. We talk about that world as external, as outside of our beings, our brains, our minds. And this is just the words we're using to describe it. We say it's out there. And we describe this world in the third person, as opposed to the world of experience, which is given to us, which is represented in the form of depending who you ask, manifest image in analytic philosophy or life world in phenomenology. It is subjective as opposed to objective. It is private, which means that you have privileged access to that world. Privileged access, only you know your thoughts. And we say it's mental, okay? It's not, as opposed to mind independent, it's mental. It's internal, it's inside somehow. Here we automatically evoke the spatial concepts. We are inside our body, I suppose. And it's usually a first-person account. Our experience is described usually from the first-person perspective, how I see the world, from my position in the world here now. So these are the two languages, and indeed, the way we talk about it seems to presuppose that there are two worlds. We use different languages to talk about this. And what I do often in this sort of conversations, I use concept of space as a way to dispel this notion of two worlds. I use it as if it were an antidote for dualism, for this science versus arts or science versus design dualism. For architectural discussions, this notion of space is particularly useful because space is famous as a material for architecture and as a material for science. But it's more than that, I will point out. And what I will present in the end is what I would call a spectral view of disciplinarity. By spectral, I mean that there are more than two parts. It's rather a polyphonic view or symphonic even. It's a symphonic view of space. And you will see what I mean in a moment. I will point out that there are multiple concepts of space. Each one is wonderful and diverse, and it could be self-contained. And because there are so many concepts of space, we need to have a system. We need a way to map them out before we get too confused and entangled in these different concepts of space. And what I do in these situations, I create this continuum from left to right here, going from mind-independent world, supposedly studied by the sciences, and the socially constructed world on the right, which is the world of our minds, our literature, our inventions. And just to give you a sense of what I mean by this, I think everybody will agree that galaxies and mountains and trees and objects out there, they are independent of our mind. They still exist when we don't look at them, we don't think about them. And on the other end, there are literary characters in between. So you have something like a brain. Brain is a physical object which could be studied objectively by the sciences from the outside, so to speak. And then there is a mind, which is in the middle of my continuum, a very special kind of entity. Here I use the painting by Magritte, the Belgian surrealist, to represent mind. This is my favorite image of the mind. Every time I say mind, this is the image that pops up in my mind. So you can imagine my head having that interesting shape. Okay, and then there are objects that are physical, but also that also embody some cultural creations, such as this lion man, a creation of apparently 40,000 years ago. It's an example of mythical creature embodied in a physical form, in a physical object. Money, boundaries between countries, borders, rather cities, they are mixed in that sense. And of course, literary characters, which are pure creations of our culture. They could be embodied in different books of different shape and weight and color, but the character remains the same in these different embodiments. And this is an example of socially constructed creature. Think of your favorite literary character. That's it. That's a socially constructed being. So coming back to space, kinds of space, species of space. Let's just see how concepts of space are thought of along the spectrum from left to right. Naturally, we begin with the physical space. And here I give you a few examples of what physicists mean by space on different scales, mathematically, as for example by this person, Minkowski, who created mathematical system, who inspired, who was a professor of Einstein in Zurich, and who inspired some elements of Einstein's theory of relativity, which is the kind of space that most people think about today when you ask them what is space, the space of relativity. There is also space of cosmology. There is space inseparable from time. This is a book by Hans Reichenbach, which is an important point in the history of science as well, not only in the history of physics. For those of you who would like to review history of concepts of space and physics, I would recommend this book at left by Max Jammer, for which Einstein wrote an introduction. Apparently, Einstein's penultimate writing appears in this book. There is much to say about this, but I don't want to dwell on it, just to illustrate what we mean by physical space. The space of the universe, the space of physics, of geography as it exists before we start thinking about geography. Okay, this is the space of physics. Needless to say, this is a big theme, and if you are a physicist or geographer, you could spend your lifetime fully encased by these concepts of space and not think once about other concepts that will appear on the spectrum in a moment. The next station is very large as well. It includes a concept of space that I would call either physiological or psychological. And here is just one example to begin. This is the German physicist, philosopher Ernst Mach trying to represent what he meant by space. This is a drawing of Mach's study. He's reclining here in his long chair and drawing the room, and you could see his body and you could see the left side of his nose. This is a view of Mach's world from Mach's left eye. And you could see a little bit of mustache here. This is the world in space as it is given to the person. And of course, Mach contributed a lot to our early understanding of how neural systems work, in addition to his very important physical work. Very similar to Mach's ideas, but different in important respects. The ideas of, say, Gestalt psychologists early in the 20th century. This is one of the seminal books in that field by Kurt Koffka, and they all talk about space in different respects. Even in this book by Mitchell Ash, a fascinating history of Gestalt psychology, he represents what Gestalt psychology was about by spatial notion. He shows this, what I would think was a field as a concept that was central to Gestalt psychologists. And of course, there is infinite number of books and articles dedicated to space, given to us visually, in experience, given to us in physiological studies. This is a summary of neurophysiological studies of what we mean by space and perception. Of course, when I talk about experience in this context, this is the experience as it is described publicly. It's not the experience that you have while trying to understand what you experience as space. So this is another seminal book by Bella Julius, Foundations of Cyclopean Perception, having to do with how we come up with vivid experience of three-dimensional space, given information to eyes, etc. This is computational take on what space is by David Marr, extremely influential book for a number of reasons, not only in physiology. So I could continue. This is a very large discipline in which we use methods of a number of sciences. I will mention them in a second, to study sensory space. It's space that you access by vision or audition. Motoric space, which has to do with how you move with space and how your body conceives space in preparation for movement. We could talk about that a little bit later, because this theme could be important for this conversation. There's also affective space in terms of values that we attribute to different parts of space as we plan and execute movements. And these are the sciences that I mentioned. You could be physiologist or psychophysicist or psychologist or cognitive scientist to talk about space. And I put them as a separate station before I go into next one. I just want to point out that a separate station on my continuum means that you use language and you think about space differently from a different station. And just as in physics, if you are any of those professionals in psychophysics or cognitive science, of course, you're aware of physical notions of space, but you use a different language. And we could talk about what this language is and how the space is construed differently to begin with from this station as opposed to that station. Now, all of that, all of these are scientific disciplines where, as I mentioned, space is talked about in public terms. And here is a separate station in the middle of my continuum where space is what happens to you essentially here and now, or as a medium or frame in which what happens to you here and now takes place. And to say that, I use all sorts of spatial concepts because place, of course, is a spatial concept too. And there is a considerable discussion in modern literature about place versus space. Of course, it's bound to the way we use language, to which I will turn in a moment. But here is just one example, which I recommend. It's a beautiful book by Edward Casey, having to do with a history of phenomenological notions of space. Remember, a few minutes ago, I showed you the book by Max Jammer, Concepts of Space. It's mostly physical history, or rather, history of physical concepts of space. Here you have a history of phenomenal concepts of space. Another example of many that I could give is Merleau-Ponty, of course, which is increasingly popular in the circles. He is best known for his magnum opus, Phenomenology of Perception. This book is a summary of lectures he gave in the 40s on the French radio, essentially summarizing much of what he had to say in Phenomenology of Perception. So this is the phenomenal station, and the history of phenomenology is very interesting. And it's important to recognize that there is no one phenomenology out there. It's a field of, I would say, area of construing the problem. But these individuals, and let me add here, Merleau-Ponty, they created sort of, each created phenomenology of their own. So I don't know if you're exposed to any of these characters other than Merleau-Ponty.
Yes, but here in the class, not yet. We didn't talk about him yet.
It just so happens, it could be a source of fascination or despair, but each one of these individuals created their own phenomenology, their own way of thinking about it. And reading a couple of articles, or maybe a dozen articles about each one of them, will not give you the power, so to speak, to understand what the heck they're talking about, because they developed a world of their own, each one of them. And just to illustrate a simpler notion from Merleau-Ponty, here is a quote from that book, The World of Perception, where he says, "The world of perception, or in other words, the world which is revealed to us by our senses and in everyday life, seems at first sight to be the one we know best of all. For we need neither to measure nor to calculate in order to gain access to this world, and it would seem that we can fathom it simply by opening our eyes and getting on with our lives. Yet this is a delusion," he says. "The world of perception is to a great extent unknown territory, as long as we remain the practical or utilitarian attitude." This is a way of thinking about perception, very typical of Merleau-Ponty. He says we spend considerable time understanding space from the, say, physical or mathematical point of view, but this here and now had remained, at the point where Merleau-Ponty was writing, it had remained an unknown territory. And I think it had remained an unknown territory until very recently. And just now we're beginning to understand what space of experience really is. I just want to point out that these phenomenologies together, they make up what is called philosophical phenomenology, as opposed to a number of schools of Gestalt psychology that I mentioned before, and they make experimental branch of phenomenology. There's a number of schools. I don't want to go into this now. It just so happens that this person, Franz Brentano, is a fountainhead for entire tree of both philosophical and experimental phenomenology, which is important because for Brentano, the impulse came from his attempt to define what he called psychology as an empirical science. He wanted to make an empirical science, and he made distinction between genetic psychology, which is similar to what we call physiological psychology today, and descriptive psychology. Descriptive psychology was his focus, and he called descriptive psychology phenomenology sometimes, and that's where we start with the entire history of Husserl being Brentano's student, and then Heidegger being Husserl's student, etc. And Merleau-Ponty was not a student of either, but he read voraciously into Husserl and Heidegger, etc. Okay, so and approaching the right end of my spectrum, there is a whole family of concepts of species of space, which I would call instrumental, including architecture. And here I show the book of Rudolf Arnheim, which is interesting in this context because Arnheim was trained as a Gestalt psychologist. He came to the United States and became a foremost psychologist of art. But this is the book he wrote about architecture, and I will return to this book hopefully in a moment. So architecture is one example of instrumental space, and architects often talk about space as if it were material for their work, for their design. Their books titled Architecture as Space. There is a famous book by Bruno Zevi, etc. Of course, instrumental concepts of space are not only architectural, linguistic concepts of space. Here I show a book that studies concept of space in Greek thought by Kempe Algra. It's a good example because concept of space used by in the context of Greek thought, in ancient Greek thought, they don't map easily on the concept of space that we use now. The three words that were common, topos, the best known one is topos, giving rise to our topology and topography and whatnot. Also kinen and kora, they use three words. Kinen had the meaning of what we would call void today, and kora was a more philosophical, at least the way it is understood today. Kora was used, for example, by Plato in his speculative cosmology, sort of primordial matrix out of which the world was created, sort of the primordial space. And naturally, I'm sure in this circle of this class, we speak multiple languages, and if we had more time, we could try and see how these words that we use in different languages, how they fail to map easily on one another, and how our being members of different linguistic communities, when we talk about space, we already there, when we just pronounce, when we utter the word, we mean different things.
Yes.
And another example, of course, of concept of space in art is a history of representing space. This is, this one example of space represented before we invented perspective. This is perspectival representation. Then we're departing. This is Cézanne, late 19th century. We're going back into flat, so to speak, flat representations. This is Picasso and modern art, the Mondrian. We come back to flatness. So I'm showing all that just to indicate that these are also concepts of space which are instrumental. Say perspective, it was developed over centuries as a refined theory and as a practice in order to represent space. Linguistic, architectural, pictorial, they're all instrumental concepts of space. And finally, we come to the station, which I could call poetic concepts of space, because they have to do with more intimate notion of how we conceive space. And the best example of that, of course, is Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space. Or in literature, this is Mikhail Bakhtin, the founder of Russian formalist school, who, for example, invented the concept of chronotopos, or chronotop, time space, in order to understand how certain literary forms evolve. So, for example, his notion of chronotopos, or chronotop, was evoked in order to trace how novel, as a literary form, how novel evolved from medieval times to modern times. So he would say that different kind of literary form would come to being because the authors reconceived the time space of the literary world. And you could think about literary characters moving through space and how spatial ideas pop up in your mind as you read a novel, inevitably, etc. So these are all elements of poetic space, and naturally, this poetic space are many. We could call them narrative or imaginative, if you like. This is a separate topic, and as I go, and I repeat, on every station, it's a self-contained world. You could think about space in these terms alone, or in architectural terms alone, or pictorial terms alone, depending on who you are and what your profession is. Okay. Now, to summarize this multiplicity of concepts of space, I like to evoke the notion of spectrum from physics. This is spectrum of electromagnetic waves on which the so-called light occupies a limited position. This is so-called visible light, but there are many other kinds of electromagnetic waves. They make a spectrum, and visible light, usefully, is what we think of as light, this little part of the spectrum. In a similar sense, I would argue that when we talk about space, because of our professional deformations, this is the term that's used by sociologists. This is what quote unquote education does to us. From our native state of being open to a variety of ideas and receptive to any kind of notion, we are getting educated, which means that we become receptive only to this narrow band of ideas and irresponsive to other ideas. Not always, but often. So that this is what happens. We are tuned to one another concept of space. And I think it is very important to take a step back. And before we think about space and body in this context of design and science, we want to appreciate that as we utter these words, space and body too, we mix into them a variety of self-contained ideas. Self-contained in the sense that they could stand on their own feet. So before we talk about space or body in any sort of mixed or integrated way, I find it useful to break them to parts, to understand how parts work, and then try to recompose, to synthesize again. So maybe we could pause here, and I'll have a question for you.
You have a question for us, okay?
Maybe you have questions for me, but let me start with a question for you.
Okay, maybe you can stop sharing your screen for a moment so we can communicate better. And there was also one question from Louise in the audience, but I would ask you to wait a little and wait until the end. So Sergei, go ahead.
Well, we could put our questions in any order. But if I can ask my question now, I would ask you the following. I think I demonstrated that indeed we have multiple concepts of space that are different enough to create a world of their own, because each of the stations is indeed a world into itself. My question is, how come we are talking about space in each one of them? What is it? What is the ingredient, so to speak, that makes us talk about space in each of these different stations? as if it were one concept? That's my question.
Okay, maybe I can start with one possible answer.
Please.
And then I could challenge then our students and the audience to come up with something. This is a really interesting question. To me, the immediate and very fast answer that comes to my mind is to say that I would think of space, seeing it with all these different perspectives, as a kind of field of infinite possibilities. This would be how I would describe it in a very abstract way. And I would say possibilities for action, but also for imagination, for abstraction. So in this very open way. That would be my attempts to give an answer.
I see. So yeah, so you're talking about space as possibilities, as the key idea as possibilities.
Yes.
A variety of possibilities, potentialities, maybe.
Yes, potentialities, and also of I think probably I think about it in terms of action, yes, in terms of action and potentiality, but also maybe in terms of forces or energy. Maybe because I was influenced with your diagram with the light and the other kinds of rays, so I'm also thinking about what kind of energy fields could be involved in this. So yeah.
Thank you, Maria. I see what you mean.
Okay, so anyone would like also to give an answer to this question? I would be very curious about your. Miguel, you would like to say something? We can't hear you. We can't hear you yet? No, not yet. Maybe we can take another answer while Error 43 sort out their technical problem.
Well, before I wasn't raising my hand, but somehow my computer wants me to raise my hand. So, but now I think what the question about is space for me is it takes a lot of concepts, and one is understanding where are we or where we are, and that comes to the concept of place. And as soon as we understand where we are, then we quite describe what we see as a space. And for me, they both go together, just to understand place and space. So somehow, as soon as you understand where you are, then you understand what is the space where you are at. So that's kind of a difficult question to answer of what is a space, because always you create your own space in your mind as soon as you locate yourself somewhere. So somehow, if you are in an open space, let's say in a park, sitting under a tree, in a bench, you create your own idea of what is that space in particular. But as soon as you go inside to a space that you have a roof on top of your head, then you understand there is another type of a space, and you are locating yourself in place, because one is an open space or is open to the sky, whether the other is just below under the roof. So somehow you start understanding what is the difference between space, even though one is with a roof and the other one is without the roof. So somehow you understand that there is a space, and they're completely different. They're completely different atmospheres, different understanding of where you are. So it is always related with place as soon as you understand space. I'm not sure if I'm clear with what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I see what you mean, Luis.
That's that's quite interesting, no? To understand what is a space. Well, it depends on where you are and what is your place.
Yes, yes. Thank you so much, Luis. It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
Indeed, maybe the unifying idea, the underlying idea is that when we talk about space or different kinds of space, it's location or locatedness, right? To add to this, I just want to say that a complementary to that is the concept of distribution, or being distributed. You know, when we are acting in space, when we're moving, when we think about any temporal process, quite often they're distributed in space. So in each one of these concepts of space, perhaps there is this primordial, elementary, basic notion of being located somewhere. And if you can be located, you can be distributed, right? So there's this notion of location and extension of some sort, which could be common to all of them. Yeah. So we could continue this question. We could continue looking at different ways to answer this question, but I pose this question just to plant it into your minds. I would suggest you think about it. It is a very curious phenomenon indeed that we have come up with so many different concepts of space, and nevertheless they appear to be manifestations of the same raw, fundamental core idea. And what that idea is not very clear. But I would argue that if one thinks that all these concepts of space derive from one station on my continuum, I think that would be a wrong answer. So the scientists may think that there is really one space out there. The core concept of space is what we call physical space, even though calling space physical is tricky, but I hope you know what I mean. So they would argue that this concept of space is fundamental and primary in a way, and all others secondary. And I tend to disagree with that point of view because I believe that this different concept of space, multiple stations that I've just talked about, these ones, they are all together. They add up to what we mean by space. It just so happens that the world of spaces is so large that no single field of inquiry can contain it. And curiously, the word for space or place in Hebrew is one of the names of God, and it is an interesting way of thinking about it as a notion that is omnipresent and omnipotent, and this is what space could be to certain thinkers. And this is, of course, a line of thought that was exercised in different parts of the spectrum.
Sergei, I have a question here. Just a small question before you move forward, because I was thinking, so when we're traveling in space, so as astronauts in space, our conception of space is not necessarily bound to, because we were talking about material. Also, it's not in that context, it's not bound to material, it's bound to some idea of place which is given by coordinates. But this is somehow also very abstract. So this is also another way of conceiving space, which is in some ways a little detached from material or embodied way of thinking about space.
Well, are you asking about defining space in terms of coordinates as one way of thinking about space, being abstract as opposed to embodied? Is that what you're asking, Maria?
No, I'm just asking how would you add in your construction, because it's highly complex, how would you add this aspect of space? Because I was trying to locate it in terms of place. So since I don't have any material reference point, I have to think about the abstract way to define it, which is by coordinates. So how would you integrate outer space into this?
Yes, certainly. The coordinate system is a way of thinking about space that was invented in this part of my spectrum. Mm-hmm. It's a mathematical notion of space. As it happens, the history of physical concepts of space is a history of creating different coordinate systems. So you could think of Cartesian coordinates, in which if you talk about solid three-dimensional space, it's a three-dimensional systems of coordinates where each position is defined by three values, x, y, and z, usually called so. And then there were different concepts of space, which is curved. So Minkowski, whom I mentioned, developed different concepts of space where these coordinates are curved, helping Einstein to develop his notion of space in physics, where this system of coordinates, this grid, is deformed by mass, for example. So these are concepts of space that were very important for physics, but these concepts are not, at least in that form, are not immediately useful to someone who is interested in space architecturally or choreographically. Yeah. So, and this is one of the points I'm trying to make, that in order to understand what space is within your station, phenomenal, physiological, architectural, you have to come up with different concepts of space which serve you. And those concepts do not readily map or correspond to or relate to in any obvious way to concept of space developed by the physicist, for example.
Mm-hmm. Tatiana has a question also.
Yes, please.
Oh yeah, thanks, Maria, and thanks, Sergei, for your talk, the start of your talk. I don't really have a question, and I also don't have an answer to Sergei's question. I have mere fragments of ideas, if I can just throw those out. Is that possible?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. So it's a very interesting framework. And of course, this is an ongoing conversation, but I think one thing that I keep thinking about when I look at this framework is that in all of these very interesting conversations about experience, we're actually not even getting close to experience itself. I'd like to really start bringing architecture into this conversation, and some others have mentioned this, that this is very abstract. I think to take this conversation to the next level, we would really need to confront real buildings in space, really confront, the embodied experience in space of the user. And so another fragment is about Bakhtin. I think what Bakhtin taught us really in his analysis is the place of the reader, right? How to imagine the place of the reader in the work, and how we might allow the reader to enter time-space on his own terms. That is, one of the valuable lessons from Bakhtin, at least for me. But I'm kind of anxious because I feel like in all of these very abstract conversations and the beautiful framework, we're not even getting close to understanding what Bakhtin meant. And so to take all of this to the next level, I guess this is sort of a challenge to Sergei, is to really begin to confront real buildings in space, because buildings have the most to teach us about this, right? And so all of this talking about experience, it's a little bit ironic because it's intellectualizing something that, the real personal experience is beyond words, we might argue. And then a final fragment is, I think about where we might place this kind of conversation. Architects sometimes divide theory, practice, and experience. Let's see this as these three parts, right? Practice is, of course, the design process, which we haven't even gotten to. Experience belongs to the user. And as we know, there are multiple experiences and multiple viewpoints. We haven't gotten there either. but perhaps we will. And so where we are residing today, I think, is in the realm of theory, which might actually make certain architects and critics a little bit uncomfortable. We may relate theory with speculation. We've talked about that word a lot. Harry Mulgrave is very skeptical these days of theory, even though he taught it for 40 years. And so I'm not really sure what the question is, but I would ask Sergei to respond to one or two of these fragments.
Yeah, certainly. These are very good questions. And very briefly, I would say, Tatiana, that the reason I'm talking about these different concepts of space and don't talk directly about architecture is to try and help us to take a step back and think about this concept outside of the convenient frameworks in which we got accustomed. So I actually want, when we talk about architectural space, I want to kick architects out of their convenient modes of talking about buildings. So if I ask you to talk about architectural space, you would give me a spiel which you've been given many times, and about different specific spaces. Every architect has a number of familiar architectural spaces, buildings, and they have good reasons to do so. But those reasons are purely architectural. I would argue that this field of neuroscience for architecture, or broadly construed science and architecture, is not really about science or about architecture. It's not the case, I would argue, that this is an arena for architects to learn something about science to improve their design. Because if we think about it this way, we'll keep architects where they are, and we bring some ideas for them to add to their palette. What I think about this is different. It is an opportunity for us to create new way of thinking about all these concepts are architectural. So it is on purpose that I am not, or rather I am postponing talking about specific architecture, about specific experiences. Now, to the notion of intellectual, this spectrum suggests concepts that are intellectual and they are experiential. We have to use words in order to describe them. This phenomenal space is experience here and now. And I show covers of books rather than talk about the content at length, because if I spend a bit of time about each of the books I'm talking about, of which I show just a few, it would be a very long conversation. And I just invite you to delve into these books, so maybe you're familiar with some of them already, to see what they mean. So in this literature on the phenomenal part of the spectrum here, they talk about direct experience as it is given to you, and not about intellectual notions. So you could think of this one as intellectual. It's abstract constructs, mathematical constructs. You could think about Bakhtin's chronotope as intellectual construct in order to understand something, and you could think of that as a direct experience. You could do so. The problem is that when you evoke these words, when you talk about experience or direct experience or reader as opposed to the text, you bring in a very large amount of theoretical machinery down there. Even the claim that we could talk about experience as it is, before we get confused, we confuse ourselves with all sorts of intellectual matters and abstract matters. I would argue it is an illusion. We use language to talk about any of these notions. We are linguistically competent creatures, which means that even our description of direct experience is necessarily colored by all sorts of theoretical ideas and constructs, including the meanings of the words like space or place. It's unavoidable. The notion of direct experience in a conversation is an illusion, unfortunately, but you do have direct experience. And this is what phenomenologists, for example, are talking about. Direct experience, you could argue that they were successful to some extent, but they were criticized by creating another intellectual edifice rather than dealing with direct experience. So it is very difficult to separate intellectual from experiential in way as we talk about it. And this is essentially a topic of my next part of my presentation. So should I go there, or maybe
we can make also a small break, because I would like to make a comment here, and there's two hands. So Sergei, could you please stop sharing for a moment, because it's easier to communicate. I think it's very interesting that you brought this way of thinking about space, and with all the spectrum that you define and all the theory, because also for our students, it's the very first time that they can get a sense of the whole scope of how we can think about space. And normally we in architecture, as you rightly mentioned, we have a certain way of learning how to think about space when we design. It's very related to the way we design and build. So it's very interesting to have this wider scope. And actually, in connection to what we are doing with this course, my students, they have this exercise that they're developing over the semester. They're not doing a design project. They are working in a collection and analysis and interpretation of movement patterns. So they have to analyze and select movement patterns which they found were more connected to their habits and to their creativity, in particular during the time of the pandemic. And then they are going to reenact these patterns in connection to objects, space, and place to construct a narrative. So it's a little bit like an exercise in mimicry. And we watched before a documentary about Marcel Marceau, working only in space, only his body in space, defining space, defining object, defining interaction, social interaction. And this is a complete exercise in terms of space and what you can do with the possibilities of space, which really goes in many of these components of the diagram you showed us, because it includes the poetic, the experiential, and we can even say that it includes the more scientific part, because we know that this body is performing located in space and time, and we could even get a system of coordinates to know what's happening and mapping it out. What I find interesting, and what I would like also to ask you, is that how can we integrate in this system of thinking more broadly about space, how can we integrate the idea that we also generate space while we move, because we are constantly doing this. You showed this book from Gestalt theory with a field, this unified field of possibilities, and I had to think about this very known, of course you also know it, known drawing from Oskar Schlemmer with the body and the whole field.
Oh yeah, I know that drawing, yes.
Exactly, and this is always my favorite since more than 10 years ago. I always go back to it, and from the moment that I was during my architecture studies, I was in a yoga class and I was doing my poses, and all of a sudden I realized I'm drawing in space. I have to do something with this idea. It was like a light bulb, a million light bulbs in my head. And since then, I'm constantly thinking about this. So how can we really make a step towards this divide, that we can understand, that we can think about space like this in terms of this abstract, more fluid field of possibilities, and how can we bring that to design?
It's a wonderful question, and indeed, we have to think about this field-like notion of space. And in order to answer this question, so for example, Tatiana also asked a very interesting question just before about intellectual versus experiential. In order to come up with a way to think about it, we have to go through a number of exercises that are intellectual by their nature. We have to think about it, we have to analyze, I just give you one example. This is a drawing I show very often in the context of these conversations from the book, the cover of which appeared in my early slides. It's from the book by Rudolf Arnheim. This is the field. Yeah, you probably saw me showing that figure one way or another. The drawing is by Paolo Portoghesi, the Italian architect. So it's a plan view of some space, and the thick lines represent physical objects, walls. So think of this as an interesting garden or some sort of building, and you could walk between different walls. So there are passages, it's like a maze. So what Portoghesi was trying to show here by this thin concentric lines is what he called the forces that the building exerts on you, or the built environment exerts on you. He says the space surrounding buildings cannot be considered empty. Instead, the spaces are pervaded by visual forces generated by the architectural structures, etc. So in a way, this drawing in itself answers your question in part, because it's very much like Schlemmer's drawing of forces, lines of force, and it is a representation of a field. And I think Arnheim picked that drawing from Portoghesi because it looks like it represents a field. As a person moving through this, so imagine a person, here's my cursor, hope you can see it. The person is moving across it, and as the person is sort of traversing these boundaries, she's subjected to these forces that Portoghesi is talking about. Yeah, he talks about perceptual fields, and he talks about strength. And usually when I talk about that, I argue that these are all speculative concepts. This is a psychologist who at that point were not doing experiments. He was not an empirical scientist. He is interpreting a drawing of an architect. And he quotes Portoghesi in that chapter. This drawing appears in the very beginning of the book. So if we talk about speculation, this is an example of a beautiful speculation. By speculation in the sciences, we mean a claim made that has no direct support. And when in the previous question, Tatiana mentioned an argument made by Harry Mulgrave in his previous book, Object and Experience, I think it was, From Object to Experience, I think it was called, where he complained that architectural theory was essentially a large family of speculations, and by turning to experience, we are moving away from speculation, which is a very interesting direction of thought. I agree with Harry there, except when you turn to experience, you have to develop a way of understanding what experience is. You just discovered that it's not easy to talk about space. I could do the same sort of exercise about experience, because experience is as difficult to define as it is space, and different authors and professionals think about experience differently. That's why in the literature, in specialized literature, when you actually try to make a concrete point about it, you usually talk about behavior or perceptual experience or visual experience. You want to be specific. So this is, in a way, this drawing, it's a beginning in a trajectory that I could chart right now, and going from ideas that are rather abstract to very specific ideas, into how the space is not empty in the sense marked here by Arnheim, but also in a very concrete space, in a very concrete sense that we could measure and conceptualize and turn into instruments from our scientific understanding of what space is. And from there, the next step is, if anybody is interested, to apply these tools to analysis of specific built environments. Mm-hmm. So this is a starting point from going from abstract to very, very concrete, as concrete as you like. You take, in the end, we're developing tools now to take any built environment, take a plan view or section or whatnot, and show how this quote unquote empty space between the walls is structured by your experiences. This is our goal. It was not my plan to talk about this, but this is exactly how we would proceed.
Sergei, I would take just one more question before you continue.
Yes, I will
There
stop
was
again.
from Error 43. I hope that they can communicate now, because they are my PhD students and they are working exactly around these topics and on a very abstract level. So I hope that now they are able to make their question. Miguel? Estamos sem som e sem imagem. We don't have sound and image. Okay. Okay, maybe we have to leave it for does it work now? No? Okay, Sergei, please go ahead so that we don't waste too much time.
Yeah, we can return to that question in a moment.
Yes.
I would like to talk a little bit about body. I don't know how much time we have left, but the question of body is, I think, is at the center of this course. And just recently, you probably saw me talking about that, so I will go very quickly for this. I found myself compelled to develop a way of thinking about body that will help us to bring a number of ideas that are not common in purely scientific discourse or in purely architectural discourse. And this is the slide. Just give me a second. I will start this the show. And here is, I'm sharing the screen. Okay, so these are different ways of talking about body. Again, just like space, the concept of body has multiple readings. Here I just happen to use German words because these two words, Körper and Leib, are used in critical phenomenology. It's useful in that context because these two German words could be both, they both mean body, I understand. I don't speak German, so this is what I read about these words, and they emphasize different aspects of what body is. So Körper is body object and Leib is body subject, meaning that body object is the physical body with its objective attributes, including physiological functions. It's not static. It's not just anatomy. It's the body as it is observed by the objective method of science. It's observed from the outside, so to speak, but by science in particular, as opposed to the feeling body or lived body as it is experienced by the person or the organism from the inside, as they say. So as you look on the world from the inside outside, and I'm not. I don't think these concepts of inside and outside are terribly precise, but this is how we talk about that. So these are two concepts of body, which are incomplete, it turns out, as we talk about what body is in the context of built environment. We have to bring in the culture, concept of culture. The concept of culture, it turns out it's rather recent in the history of humanity. What we mean by culture as a concept, it's rather recent. The same Harry Mulgrave, whom we mentioned a few minutes ago, is talking about Herder, the German philosopher, bringing concept culture into discourse in the sense of culture being connection of the person to his or her immediate environment, the landscape, the buildings, the immediate local environment. Today, culture means something else, and I'm not sure this is the right term. Culture, we could be slightly more specific by saying that this is an intersubjective realm. So you could think simply that your body has an objective component studied by the science. It has a subjective component, which is your feeling of the world from inside of your body. And there is this component which has to do with effects of social and built environments, historical, linguistic, ideological, traditional, and these are they intertwined with this other tool in ways that are very interesting, multiple and very interesting. And before I go to talk about the interaction, sciences that deal with them, sciences and disciplines. Of course, this is histology, having to do with the tissue, and molecular biology. They all deal with very small scale of the body. And there is anatomy, so-called gross anatomy, having to do with systems and parts of your body on a large scale. Physiology, how the systems interact, how they function in time. Ethology has to do with observed behavior, not only animal behavior, but human behavior. There's a whole new field of computational ethology, which is very interesting. We could talk about that. So this aspect of the body is studied by different phenomenologies. As I pointed out, Husserlian and Heideggerian and Pontian, they're different phenomenologies, and they're as if they were different fields of research in themselves. And then Gestalt psychology, which is another way of thinking about body from the point of view of field concepts. And of course, Gestalt psychology being a branch of phenomenology, it is trying to take the first person view, which is why I put Gestalt psychology here. And study of culture, I mean, this is just some of the disciplines that take part in this study, and they have made contributions already into architecture. And as I hear from a number of architects, Juhani Palasma, for example, and others, that these inserts had not been very successful. They didn't intertwine enough with intrinsically architectural concepts. They remain foreign bodies and maybe cause some harm to architectural process. So here I'm just trying to show how these parts of the body are interacting in the human being. If you think of them pairwise, you have concepts of body which are rich and interesting, and this is how we talk about body most of the time. We take, usually it's pairs of these parts. So for example, if you consider only that, which is often the subject of scientific contributions to this conversation, when you consider scientific body and the subjective body, essentially this conversation does not amount to viewing human being in its fullness. It's more of an animal aspect. It's a study of animality of human being, which is incomplete in itself, but nevertheless very interesting and could take us a long way. Then there is the other one. This is if you talk about cultural dimension and an objective dimension only. A good example of that is biomedical patient, which is a statistical entity in our society, in a variety of medical cultures, and this point of view is missing the person as a feeling sort of first person entity. It's biomedical patient doesn't have an identity, so to speak, or personality. And then, of course, this is what architects complain about quite often. They talk about this disembodied observer, and the whole impetus for bringing biology into architectural discourse was caused by realization that biological being is absent from architectural discourse. And this is the case where we talk about this pair of components. It may sound paradoxical that I'm talking about culture as a part of the human body, but I do believe that it is the case because as the person is sort of looking outside on the world, his or her conception of what is experienced is necessarily filtered by language, which is just one of the projections of culture into a human being. And in that sense, concepts of culture are simply inseparable from what we call human body. And the same when we think about corpor, the body object, the objective body, the way we conceive it is framed by our language and many cultural concepts. So it is in that sense we have to talk about these components as parts of the body. And I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this, just to indicate that there are interesting projects going on understanding the relation between parts. So different parts of physiological or psychological space have to do with this. For example, in experimental phenomenology or Gestalt psychology, the vector of research, so to speak, is pointed this way, from body subject to the physical body. We use a study of experience in order to understand how it is implemented physiologically. And in psychophysics, it's the other way around. You start with physical concepts and you try to understand the mind or experience. And again, this, I mean, to describe it, I have to use words, which may sound abstract and intellectual, but I have no other way to do that. And of course, every concept that I evoke could be applied in a specific analysis of a specific building at any level of precision that you like. And the same, this absence of subject in this incomplete view is tackled today in medical anthropology. This is one example that I like to mention in this context. It's thinking about narrative view of the person to defeat the statistical, impersonal way of thinking about a patient. And of course, here there are many ways to get outside of the limited view of the person. And one example that I like to evoke in this context is the view of three dialectics developed by Merleau-Ponty in his early work. The Structure of Behavior is the first book that he wrote. And in this book, he talks about three dialectics of the world, or three orders of the world: biological, physical, and human. Actually, in the correct order, to the physical, biological, and human. And I recommend this book, in particular that part of the book. I think it's part 3 of the book, in which he helps us to understand what the distinctions are. He shows how rich each of the worlds is. Physical, for example, having produced all sorts of fantastic forms and morphogenesis, for example, where the question arises: how physical is different from biological? What does biology add to the physical to make it a new dialectic? And he would say that it's a new dimension, new virtual dimension, he calls this. Biological organisms create new dimensions to the world that are not present there in the world before the organism is added. So those force lines that I showed in the drawing, Portuguese's drawing from Arnheim's book, this is an example. This is a structure which is objectively present in the environment, but it's present only by virtue of certain properties of the organism. Mm-hmm. So the physical world has this object. So for example, the border between where you experience one thing and don't experience that thing as you move through space, that border is objectively present in the world. And I argued in some other place that you could think of that as an architectural object, because it's even more relevant to architectural design that add physical walls than physical walls that architects draw. Because if you want to think about experience, those boundaries separating one kind of experience from another kind of experience, those are the first objects that we want to draw. This is an interesting way to think about how different levels of understanding a body moving in space could be construed. And so I told you about physical versus biological, and of course from biological to human. This is in a way similar to what I'm saying, but I do invite you to visit Merleau-Ponty's book. It's more accessible than Phenomenology of Perception. The challenge is that in order to make progress in this arena, somehow we have to keep in mind all three perspectives. So if you're saying that biological perspective has been absent in architectural discourse, and we bring biological ideas. Somehow we are drawn too far to the biological end, and that's not very useful. So the challenge is how to think about the body, or about design, or about certain ideas imported from science in a way that does not neglect any of these three parts. And this is the difficult part. And when I talk about populism, and this is the theme where we started, we could talk about this at more length, but here I just want to mention that this populism is the simplification that we create for ourselves in order to sort of wrap our minds around this complexity. But at the same time, we are losing this opportunity to create a new conception of human body, which must include three parts. So the scientists who enter in this arena, they like to talk about the scientific body. Mm-hmm. And they think that they eliminate this discourse by talking about scientific mind because they scientists have a unique take on the body at the expense of other concepts. And architects, they do the reverse. So everybody is trying to stay on the turf within their zone of comfort, intellectual, experiential. What is required, and this is the challenge for participants in this conversation, to step outside of their zones of comfort. So architects should stop talking about their favorite architecture and try to enter the new way of thinking about it. Spend a little bit of time outside of their zone of comfort, and then when they come back, they will discover a new ways of thinking about the same favorite architecture of theirs. And scientists should think about the concepts that they use in this, in the way they talk about the body in a different way. So instead of trying to translate already scientific concepts to a format that could be understood by non-scientists, we want to create new concepts, which are inspired perhaps by scientific concepts, but are not the same. And this is what is needed. That's the challenge. It is a new kind of deformation that we've got to subject ourselves to. And for as long as we don't do that, we remain in this sort of in-between zone where we have been for a number of years in the state of suspended animation, talking about this, but remaining in our professional arenas.
Sergei, this was also very interesting, and I think also maybe in some ways confusing, but also helpful for our students, because like you did with space, you've also shown this very complex way of how we can think about the body and the interconnections between different aspects related to the body. And my question now has to do with the presence of the digital in our current conceptions of body and space. And I've been thinking about this, especially lately, because of everything that has been happening in the last year with working online and being able to have this really interesting conversation with you in a flat screen, in a situation where time and space feel immaterial. And very often I have found myself being unable to anchor some of these experiences in a sense of place, because the memory somehow it's embodied only in what concerns my own physical body and my immediate surroundings. It doesn't have the same complexity. So how do you add the digital in your conception now of body and space?
Yes, thank you. It's a very important question. But before I answer this question, I just want to point out how when asking this question, you're talking about physical body.
Yes.
And we are accustomed to think about body as physical. And what you meant probably is a collection of organs encased by skin of the person. That's the body. And what I'm trying to argue is that this concept of body, physical body, is not really the body that populates our buildings and interacts with built environment. So before I talk about digital, I just want to point out that I think of virtual reality as really the business of architecture. Architecture has created the reality which we call virtual today, long before computers were invented. I'm working with Tiziana Preti, as you know, who studied this very interesting Dutch architect, Hans van der Laan, who said that the building is how the world is present to the person inside the building. Mm-hmm. The interior is how the world is given to the person, the outside world, through architecture. And the exterior is how the person presents itself or herself to the world from the inside. So this way of thinking helps to appreciate the virtual dimension of architecture. And then when we talk about digital dimension, I like to think about it in the context of a virtual environment that architecture creates for us. So digital tools are relatively new tools. And I hear often architects complain about how using digital design, parametric design in particular, is killing the heart of architectural practice. Just recently, we heard this very interesting presentation by Mark Hewitt, who wrote this book, Drawing in Order to See, making this point that in order to connect to what we're designing through embodied experience, we have to draw rather than use tools of digital tools, the sort that you're mentioning, or God forbid, use artificial intelligence to create buildings. And I understand this warning. But I in this context, I would think that we are in a transitional stage. These computers, which we use through two-dimensional interfaces today, it's just a step in the development of new technologies, where in the near future we'll be able to so to speak, draw in 3 dimensions. Already now, many virtual environments, new sort of operating systems of virtual environments, come with demos of how you could draw in 3 dimensions. Mm-hmm. And that will be embodied experience. And computers will give us power to do that. And it will be, of course, up to individual architects whether or not to use this technology. But it will be as embodied as drawing. But beyond drawing, it will remove the interface of 2 dimensions. Mm-hmm. You'll be able to sculpt, so to speak. Your drawing will become more like sculpting practice.
Yes, I very much look forward for that. I'm waiting for that tool since 10 years. And this paper I sent you recently was a first attempt to conceptualize how we could have a computational tool that could go into this direction. So I really look forward to it. And I agree, when I mentioned the body before, I didn't mean the body as just the organs put together around an envelope, because I also see the imagination and everything that we can conceive as embodied, because it only happens since we have a body anyway. But it was interesting to hear your response, and especially with your statement that we should definitely connect also to the potentials of the virtual, to what they can bring also to this embodied or more physical body we have, because we see that although what's happening here is kind of immaterial, but it does happen in the material world. We have a computer, and we can even somehow feel some space around us while we communicate. But what is interesting is really to think about this further step, where we will be able to have tools that will allow us to experience this embodiment while working with the virtual in a way that it also can respond to our imagination in a more complete way. Of course, anyone who draws, and I'm sure Leonardo da Vinci, when he was drawing, he could perfectly think three-dimensionally and fourth-dimensionally. And for him, the drawing was just a way of pinning down the ideas. He didn't need the computer, and he had everything in his head. But he moved a lot, and he was fascinated with movement and everything that had to deal with movement in space. Before I start rambling too much, because I am fascinated with these topics and I could also continue for a long time, but my colleagues from Portugal, they have the hand up and I think they solved their technical problems. So Miguel.
Okay, can you listen to us?
Yes, yes.
Perfect. So our question was regarding still like the space, and it's pretty much going in the same direction as what we are talking now, which is like robots, meaning that robots, like in order for them to understand where they are spatially, they need multiple sensors that we are developing as we go on. And but then there's this other question, which is like if you program a robot to react to some, I don't know, environment, for the robot or for the processor who is like performing the actions, it does not matter if it's in a physical world or in a virtual world. Okay, so and then like this makes me think that regarding the question what is space, that maybe space is nothing more than our sensors, our organic sensors, perceiving some basic rules that we need in order to survive. And then if we think about like and I think you talked a bit about AI systems. If you think about these AI systems and how they can like sorry, this is a personal view, but I see it as the next evolution of humanity. Like, but what they will perceive, because like the rules for them will be different since their bodies will be completely different. Like then I think it can maybe break our notion of space or a notion of space. And I was just interested in your point of view towards this.
Yes, thank you so much for asking this question. It is indeed the case that introducing new kinds of agency, such as artificial intelligence, embodied, will engender some new concept of space, which will have to fall somewhere on this continuum. And I don't know where to place it yet. I just want to make a disclaimer. When I put the stations on the continuum, I don't try to make a specific claim about number of the spaces. I'm not saying that there are 7 or 8 of them. I use that continuum as a framework, convenient framework, to talk about how there are different concepts of space. And so when you think about an embodied AI, a robot acting in the world, of course, certain representation of space will be built into the robot in order for it to operate. And the question becomes then how flexible this representation is. The question really is how much the robot is allowed to learn. What happens in biological organisms across evolutionary scale, from simple organisms to human beings, from that point of view, is an evolution of representation, you could say. So there are simple representations in which sensory stimuli, as you mentioned, are represented directly. But on top of that, we have representations which are sometimes called meta-representations, which read this first order representations. So there is some self-referentiality. And in that evolution, the concept of self emerges. You see, if you have only representations that respond to what's given to you as you move through space, it's not enough to have a concept of self. You have to be able to have an extra layer, you need to add an extra layer to this representational framework in order to develop a concept of self. So you understand where you are in the world, not in terms of direct reflection of what is present to you immediately, sensorially, in where you are, but in terms of understanding that this is you are in the world. And what happened in a human being, for example, there are multiple levels of this self-referential representations. And this meta representations allow us to create an infinite number of worlds, literature, for example, that has nothing to do with direct stimulation. You could imagine anything in any location, even though certain locations induce certain kinds of imagination. So this is how I think about it. This evolution of representations, and when you talk about artificial intelligence, it's the question of whether these agents would be allowed to generate these extra levels of representation, and if that happens, they will create their own. They could create their own worlds, their own literature, so to speak, new kinds of imagination that may be inaccessible to humans unless we developed a way to communicate at the level of complexity that would allow us to probe, as if in a conversation, what those representations or worlds are.
Thank you, Miguel. This was a really interesting question. And I was thinking, and what's going to happen when these artificial intelligences or robots, when or if they develop a sense of self or a sense of I have to think of all the history of science fiction, starting with Stanley Kubrick's Hell and going to Prometheus, David, that at some point the machine becomes a little bit angry with the forefathers and develops some schemes.
and like this AIs or these minds, they don't have to be localized. Thinking of the body, I want to remind you of this fantastic novel by Stanisław Lem, a Polish science fiction writer, the author of Stellaris, most famously. The novel is called Invincible, and this is a novel in which they encounter a kind of intelligence which is not localized. So it's as if there are these nanoparticles that are coming together, forming a cloud, and as they come into proximity, they create a collective intelligence. We have a term for that in modern theoretical biology. It's called swarm intelligence. It has slightly different meaning, but I think this is pretty close. So this is intelligence that emerges out of these multiple particles, and they effectively can affect the mind of that astronaut, etc. But it's a very interesting novel, but it's useful for us to remember it now because intelligence can be distributed, and body doesn't have to be contiguous in space.
But like in the notion of self, I think that there's an important part which is like the part that we don't control, which is our system maintaining us alive, and assuming that this will still be a part of the self of the machine. Like this will bring, since the system will be doing different processes, I imagine, this will also bring different ways of understanding things and different limits towards the space.
Yes, and of course the word control is critical here. We do control our bodily systems, even though we much of the time we have no conscious awareness of those bodily systems, of how internal organs operate and all that. I mean, there's autonomous neural system, so-called, because it's not directly controlled in most situations by your mind, by your awareness. It has sympathetic and parasympathetic parts, which is like push and pull. They perform opposite functions in your body, etc. So this term of control is interesting. It is a way of, on the one hand, you could think of this as a way of awareness. You know, you're aware of your body, of what your body is doing. but you don't have complete insight into it. And this is, if you take this idea to the conceptual level, when we're talking about body and how there are three parts in it, you see, there's a problem that is built into that conception, which I may very briefly mention, that different actors in this interdisciplinary arena, they have assumptions about what is primary out there in the world, which are incompatible with one another. Scientists, not all of them, of course, but many, they assume that primary reality is physical. In my three-partite illustration, so let me just show the slide again. So the scientists would believe that this is the real body, and all of that is a reflection. All other aspects are reflection or projections of this body, just like physical world is ultimately physical in the sense of material. All of these terms need philosophical unpacking, but the scientists believe that world is basically material, and our perceptions of the world are imperfect appearances, and cultural projections of the world, they're just like that, imperfect impressions of the world on the culture. Now, the phenomenologist would claim that no, physical world is a construct. The actual reality, the only reality we can know, is the one which is given to us directly in experience. This is the reality, what we sense. And when we talk about physics or poetry or literature, more generally, these are all projections of some form from this fundamental impulse of us confronted with the world. And you find different readings of that in Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, for example, very different readings, but in early Heidegger, it's the same idea, right? But then there is the third platform. There's a platform in which this intersubjective is primary. So there is this very popular talk today about socially constructed facts, that everything is socially constructed, absolutely anything, including scientific facts. This is the position where you stand on the intersubjective platform and say, everything we can think of, imagine, or perceive is filtered through language. Language or word is the fundamental concept. And what we experience is necessarily filtered or framed or shaped somehow by how language is operating, how this particular linguistic culture is operating, and science is the same. So linguistic is one, or other intersubjective notions are fundamental. And one of the difficulties we are facing in this new arena, when we're talking about the human body, for example, when we have these conversations, each one of us, I bet, has an assumption that world is ultimately like this. It's a world that is fundamentally physical, or it is subjective, or it is culture driven. And the point I made when I prepared the slide was that it is useful to remember how our professions or disciplines are constrained, they're limited by how our disciplines are constituted, what they are by necessity. So we can say different things from different disciplinary platforms, and we will be insensitive to other things because our worldview, which is an imperfect term, but let's use it for now. Our worldview, professional worldview, is limited by our profession, and this limitation of our profession allows us to do wonderful things within our profession. These are enabling conditions. So our limitations are sources of our strength, in a way, and that's why we are so deeply embedded in our professions. So the difficulties that we have, they are real, and the professions and disciplines are established for good reason. And it's not that we could just abolish this disciplinary divide magically by just saying, oh, let's open the boundaries between our disciplines. It cannot happen easily. And this is why, in order to make progress in this new area, we have to do this difficult work of discovering, creating new concepts, new ways of thinking about, say, architecture or design that is different from traditional architectural ways of thinking about it, and different from scientific too. That's the heavy lifting, and that we will need to do. And the populism with which I started is unfortunately the state of affairs in which people stay in their arenas, and they're just afraid to go outside. They like to talk about the other. The scientists talk about the architects who don't understand why scientists need this rigor, why scientists need measurement, why mathematics is so important. So scientists is sometimes vilified for being attached to mathematics for some reason. They have this mathematical fetish. And architects they try to understand science, but when they come in close contact with science, they stop often because they don't want to reduce their art to a formula, as they say. Yeah, and this is just one example of misunderstanding between disciplines. So what we need to do is to find the courage to step outside of our disciplines and try and think about the new questions in a way that I was trying to suggest. And of course, I did focus mostly on just ways of thinking about it rather than examples of how it is implemented. But how it is implemented could be a topic of another conversation.
Well, but I think we had a very good start, because I think it's not often that we have in classes this kind of conversation, and also this kind of questions and this way of relating the concepts. And I'm sure that our students, they might be a little bit overwhelmed because they heard a lot of new things and new concepts that they didn't hear about before. But I would just challenge them before we leave for one more question. I think Laura would like to ask a question. I noticed that she was. No?
Actually, I don't have a question. I was just wanted to say thank you, because I always struggled with the idea of space, because in our daily lives studying architecture, it is used so specific, as if it would be one specific concept. And I always personally struggled with this idea, because I didn't know where it started, where it ended. And so now I know there are more concepts and you can think of it in a broader way. So it was overwhelming sometimes, but it helped me actually to think about space more openly.
Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, I think it was very important, exactly, to broaden the view of how we can see these topics. And it's also my intention with these classes and with this cycle of conversations to bring all these different inputs, to have these conversations, and also to show that there is a lot of knowledge and positions and perspectives which have not come from the traditional way that we are thinking about architecture, but that we need to start incorporating in architecture. This was also a little bit challenging for me this time to tap into many of these concepts, because my reading of phenomenology was already some time ago, so I had to bring it back. Oh, I think Tatiana also wants to ask something.
Yes, well, I don't have a question. I just wanted to thank both Maria and Sergei. This was a fascinating, very important conversation. And I guess the question is, what is the next step, right? And how do we reach that next step? How do we really make progress? So I completely agree with Sergei about the challenges and the need for a new way of thinking. That's what we've been working on for a very long time. But I would also encourage Sergei to not postpone a true confrontation with architecture, simply because, we need a true intertwining of these ways of thinking. And so I would say, the best way to make progress a little bit more quickly, even though, we're patient, but let's take the next step and let's really confront the experience of the thing itself. That doesn't mean that we need to stay within our own worlds, absolutely not. But let's confront that experience and let's think about, you know, the difference. I mean, the truth is in the thing itself, right? Whether that thing is a work of poetry or the experience of a building or a landscape, the truth is in that thing. It's not in the talking about the thing. And even though frameworks are incredibly helpful, and I've seen this framework now a few times, it helps me to think about it, but I'm really ready for that next step. So just to finish, let's imagine a poem by, let's say, Bela Akhmadulina or Marina Tsvetaeva. So what is the difference between analyzing that poem as a critic, talking about that poem, and the experience when you yourself read that poem and you have a real emotional experience and attachment with it? What is the difference between those two things?
Thank you, Tatiana. It's a very interesting question, and there are several questions. Let me start from the end of what you're saying, direct experience. The difference is that you engage different levels of your being in this process. You sort of reconfigure yourself in order to address different aspects of, in this case, artistic text. And the reason I want to separate them is to make it clear that there's a different layers, and it just so happens that each of these layers is very well developed, and it may be not given to every individual. Not all of these layers are given to every individual. Experiential level is open to everyone, of course, but also to a different extent. You see, if you are a literary critic reading Akhmadulina or Brodsky or Shakespeare, your reading will be inevitably different from someone confronting it for the first time, a novice, someone who has not been interested in literature at all. Architecture is the same. An architect entering Basilica San Lorenzo in Florence and a tourist just stumbling upon it for the first time will have different experiences necessarily. Even if that architect, I don't know if it's possible, but even if that architect has not ever heard of that basilica and just stumbled upon it, by nature of his training, he will pay attention to different aspects of the built environment. So in a way, these layers are separate in terms of that we could think about them and understand how they are constituted separately. But in actual happening in the real world, they are intertwined, as you mentioned. They are all present to a different extent. So I gave you this metaphor of light, where we are aware of just one part of the spectrum. Another metaphor for what we are talking about is simple barcode, not the modern two-dimensional, you know, the multiple little squares built into larger square, but the old-fashioned linear barcode. So all this concept of space, the presence of this different concept of space are locations on the barcode. And in every encounter, in every living direct encounter with the world, different parts of the strip light up, different bars. This is the metaphor of barcode. And by educating ourselves about different ways of thinking about space, for example, we evoke in ourselves new capabilities of understanding what's going on. So a person trained only in physics and physiology, for example, could be less sensitive to other parts of the spectrum, but by exposing yourself to these ideas, by thinking about them carefully and applying these ideas in your daily experience, you will you will evoke different parts of your being. It will be fuller, more interesting experience. Now, to the question of the next step, I could tell you how I'm trying to do this, and there are specific projects in which I'm taking part. One project has to do with understanding what the structure of space is experientially. So using that drawing of Portuguese, I introduced the idea of how space is not empty, how it's pervaded by some sort of structure. So what I'm doing is revealing that structure. So it could be used in design. And I alluded to that point briefly when I said these boundaries of experience, they're architectural objects, primary architectural objects, and architects don't use these objects explicitly because they remain implicit. So I'm trying to explicate them and make the structure of experience, special experience, useful. This is one project. Another project that I do in collaboration with Tiziana Preti that appeared in the previous version of this conversation or this series of classes is trying to revive the concept of architectural proportion, which has been or had been central to architecture for a long time, thousands of years, and it got sort of pushed to the margins recently, in the middle of 20th century, for reasons that are not very clear, but mostly for not understanding how to think about proportion, as we removed our thinking from theological foundations. Proportional thinking lost its grounding, and it was for the lack of motivation, it was not exactly abandoned but marginalized. So what we're doing with Tiziana, we are trying to use tools of modern science in order to understand what proportion is in terms of its effects on behavior and perception. This is one of the next steps. This is actual research we are doing now using experiments in Tiziana's laboratory in order to bring proportion back into architectural discourse. Another line of work is Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, which is not only about neuroscience, not only about architecture, but it's about this arena we are talking about. So what we are doing gradually, slowly, but steadily, we are moving towards creating new frameworks for two most important directions, which I would define as research and education. What we're having now is an example of bringing these ideas into educational context, but of course it's not enough. What we need is a full-fledged program in which ideas of science and architecture or design are brought together in a series of classes. That's what will help us to make the next step. And in research, the work that I mentioned that I'm doing, for example, is extremely difficult to fund. As you know, serious research requires considerable time and resources and effort, and we have no funding agencies willing to support this kind of work at the scale that it requires. So the next step is happening very slowly and tentatively for these reasons. We don't have educational or institutional support for education of this sort, and we don't have fiscal or financial framework for making this next step happen. And these are the difficulties that we are overcoming today.
Yes, well, the constraints that we have to deal with in this kind of really groundbreaking work. We need to stop now because we started a little bit earlier with our students for almost 4 hours ago, and I think they need to go now. Sergei, thank you so much for being here, and thank you everyone who joined, especially Tatiana also for the really good questions. So thank you, Sergei, for all your contributions, and I will definitely look again into this conversation and make some notes and check again some of my books, and I might write you in sometimes an email to continue it further, because there's definitely so many things that can still continue from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So thank you everyone, and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, bye.